Hello and welcome to Sales Peak Studio. My name is Suresh Balasubramanian. In our previous week's video, I had introduced you to biases, their roots, and the way they manifest themselves as our actions and positions in everyday life. There is one thing that can be said to be universally true about human behavior. All of us have biases. Whether we like it or not, whether we realize it or not, we all carry not one, but several biases. Simply stated, biases are nothing but our brains jumping to conclusions. Today we shall explore status quo bias and its impact on our decision making. Now, it is human nature to resist change. We love to be in a comfort zone. And this inherent nature also contributes to many of our biases when it comes to taking action. Now, there are three situations that might cause someone to change. Number one, they have to be moving towards a gain. For example, I recently installed a solar panel by paying a cost upfront because I knew that it would cut my monthly electricity bill by over 60%. So I adopted something because I knew that I was clearly moving towards a gain, something beneficial. Two, the situation must be such that it is causing them to move away from pain. A lot of companies had a huge problem. Their customer wait times was a big issue. Their customers had to wait for a frustratingly long period before they could talk to a support representative, leading to dissatisfaction. With chatbots and AI agents, these companies were able to resolve this. So, by adopting these technologies, these companies were able to reduce their customer wait times significantly and help resolve their issues in almost real time. So, in this case, you have companies adopting a new technology or a new way of doing something because it is taking them away from their pain. Finally, people might consider change if it is causing them to move towards something new or something that is novel. One example of a novel use case is Amazon PillPack, which offers a prescription home delivery system that organizes medications into pre sorted packets labeled by date and time. This service created a new use case by simplifying medication management for patients, particularly the elderly or those with complex medication regimens. So, this caused a lot of people to move from the traditional pharmacist to Amazon because it offered them a very new, very novel, but very useful way of solving a real problem for them. So, what is status quo bias? It is a change resisting bias. Simply stated, it is a cognitive bias wherein individuals prefer avoiding losses over potentially higher gains. This bias is rooted in the psychological principle that the pain of losing is perceived as more significant than the pleasure of gaining a higher quantity. Now, status quo bias also has a very close relative. It is called the loss aversion bias, where the fear of losing is more than the gain of an equivalent or same amount. So, a status quo bias happens when somebody has an emotional distress from the fear of losing, say, rupees 1 lakh, that they feel more intensely than the pleasure or the satisfaction from gaining, say, 1.2 lakh rupees. This is one of the most common biases that exists in all of us. And for sure, you will encounter this bias within your customers if you haven't already. Let's look at how the status quo bias can manifest in a customer situation and what is the best way to deal with it. Let's start by looking at some examples of status quo bias. Like I said, this bias exists in all of us and can manifest in almost any situation, whether it is at home or at school or college, in public service or at the workplace. I will explain in more detail as to how this bias scrambles our brain and leads us to faulty assumptions that can cloud our decision making. So let's start with a practical example of what a customer with a status quo bias might say to you. Let's say in this case, your customer is convinced that they ought not to change their data analytics tool as it might cause them to lose all the expertise that they've built on the current platform. There are three simple steps that you can follow in order to unearth, dissect, and reframe this bias to your advantage. Let's go through them one by one. The first and the most important step is to recognize and acknowledge this concern that your customer is expressing. I have seen from experience what most salespeople do is that they'll directly jump into countering this proposition and start providing counter arguments. When you recognize and acknowledge this concern, what you're doing is demonstrating empathy, and this builds trust. So, when your customer says that they are concerned with the possible impact of changing an established system, they are showing vulnerability. Now, remember, your customer's vulnerability is your opportunity in disguise. So, when you acknowledge your customer's concern and say that you understand how changing any established system can be challenging and can cause potential disruptions, you are not being dismissive of their vulnerability. Rather, you're siding with them, and this helps strengthen trust. Now, you know in your hearts and minds that the customer is obviously exhibiting a case of loss aversion or status quo bias, which is not based on objective reality. You have to be able to get to the customer that to realize and get them to see objective reality. One way to do that is to try and get the customer to self assess a broad range of the impact of not taking a decision across a broad set of organizational goals. You can also call it the cost of doing nothing. Your goal is to change your customer's perspective from a narrow band, that is, the fear of losing all of the expertise that they've built, to a far broader and greater organizational impact. This is called creating contrast. Let's look at what is contrast and how to create contrast. Loss aversion does a funny thing to your brain. It scrambles your brain into perceiving that no action is actually a benefit and that taking action comes at a cost. Now, when this happens, your brain gets scrambled in a way that it grossly underestimates the so called benefit of their inaction, as well as overestimates the perceived cost of taking action, to a point that in their brain there is no viable trade off to taking action. So, for you as a seller, in order to be able to break through this bias with your customer, you have to be able to create a viable trade off or create contrast. So, what is this contrast that I keep referring to? It is all about making the dark darker and the white whiter. So, you will be able to create contrast when you reframe the scope and impact of both one, cost of doing nothing, and two, benefit of taking action. In order to do this, you need to add all the elements and parameters not considered by the customer, such as cost of obsolescence, the opportunity cost, the cost of competition taking a lead over them, cost of potential revenue and market share loss, etc. etc. There can be many risks associated with the cost of inaction that you ought to be able to identify and quantify. When you're able to reorient the perception and expand the scope of the actual cost of doing nothing, that is the cost of inaction, versus the potential windfall of taking affirmative action, the contrast becomes very clear and it is likely to spur action. So, when you create a contrast, you will be able to change the buyer's perception in two ways. Number one, they need to be made to understand that what they perceive to be a small benefit from doing nothing is in reality a huge cost. You ought to be able to quantify and qualify these costs in monetary terms for them to be able to see this contrast. Number two, you must also reorient their perception from one where they believe that there is a big cost of taking action to one where they can clearly see that there is actually a huge benefit to taking action. When you quantify the potential windfall of taking action in monetary terms, it will spur them to action because now they can clearly see a very viable trade-off. So we have now learned how to create contrast. You need create a contrast in the minds of your customers by changing and reframing their points of reference and the impact. This will change their perspective from a very narrow band to a far broader and greater organizational impact. Finally, you also need to be able to create a sense of urgency to make the customer realize the actual cost of doing nothing and the potential benefit of taking action. A good way to do this is through a pilot or a proof of concept where you can very quickly demonstrate the impact. Now, the timing and the stage where you offer a pilot or a proof of concept is important. I have seen many salespeople jump in quickly to offering a proof of concept or a trial without going through the proper steps in order to have the desired impact. So, offer to do a pilot or a proof of concept at the right time so that once you've changed your customers' value to cost to effort perception, it will spur them into action. Now that you've learned about status quo bias, I'd like you to practice status quo bias objections. Think of your biggest or the most important deal that you're working on presently. And think of some statement spoken by your customer or decision maker that indicates a status quo or a loss aversion bias. Think about how did you respond to your customer at that instant. And now reflecting on it and knowing a bit more about this bias, how would you respond if the same thing happened to you now? Use this exercise as an opportunity to reflect and improve your response in a manner that brings your customer's bias to the forefront and reframe it so that the customer starts seeing things differently and from your perspective. This is also an opportunity for you to improve yourself as a seller. I am happy to have you share your observations if you'd like on my email ID that I shall share in the next slide. I hope you found this session valuable. Next week, we shall discuss another very interesting topic. Please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. As always, I'm eager to hear your comments, feedback, and about topics that you may like me to cover in the coming sessions. Till next week, happy selling.